You hear the name Al Capone, and what do you think of? Pinstripe suits, right? Tommy guns, and this bloody, violent reign over Chicago during Prohibition. He's basically the blueprint for the American gangster. But here's the thing. The story of how he finally went down, it's not what you'd expect. It wasn't some dramatic shootout. Nope. It's a story about ledgers, about loopholes, and about the most unlikely heroes you can imagine. And that's the big question we're diving into, right? It's one of the greatest ironies in American history. You've got this guy who ordered countless hits, who had an entire city wrapped around his finger, and he wasn't taken down by federal agents with guns blazing. He was taken down by a quiet, methodical team with pencils and spreadsheets. So to really get how he fell, you gotta look at how he rose up in the first place. And his origin story might actually surprise you. This wasn't a tale that started in some desperate, poverty-stricken slum. Yeah, you'd think this is one of those classic rags to crime riches stories, but it wasn't. Capone's dad was an educated barber. They had a stable, respectable home. The real turning point, the fork in the road, came when Al was just 14. He actually struck a teacher, and that was it. He left school and never went back. That one decision basically rerouted his entire life, away from a respectable trade and straight into the street gangs of Brooklyn. Now, his real education in crime came from his mentor, a guy named Johnny Torrio. And Torrio wasn't your typical street brawler. He was known as a gentleman gangster. He saw crime as a business, not a brawl. He taught Capone to think bigger, to run his operation like a corporation, with strategy and organization. And boy, did Capone take that lesson to heart. He followed Torrio to Chicago, and when Prohibition hit in 1920, the entire city basically turned into a giant, untapped gold mine for illegal booze. Capone was ready to cash in. I mean, his rise to the top was just unbelievably fast. He starts in 1920 as just another guy in the organization. But then there are assassinations, brutal gang wars, a violent takeover of the whole suburb of Cicero, and by 1925, his mentor, Johnny Torrio, has had enough and retires. And just like that, at only 26 years old, Al Capone is the undisputed king of the Chicago outfit. And you ran it just like Torrio taught him, like a modern company. Capone was a CEO, setting the vision. He had an underboss, kind of like a COO, running daily operations. He had an enforcer group for, let's call it, aggressive acquisitions. And most importantly, he had a financial admin to handle all the cash. This structure made them efficient, sophisticated, and incredibly, ridiculously profitable. So, just how profitable are we talking? Well, by 1927, it's estimated his organization was pulling in $100 million a year. Let's put that in perspective. In today's money, that's over $1.8 billion, an absolutely mind-blowing amount of untaxed cash just flooding into his pocket. But look, that kind of money doesn't come easy. It's paid for in blood. And as Capone's power hit its absolute peak, so did his brutality. But, and this is the crazy part, at the exact same time, he was carefully building this public image as a hero for the common man. This is the day everything changed. February 14th, 1929, the day Capone decided he was going to wipe out his last major rival, Bugs Moran and his North Side gang, in the most shocking way possible. The plan itself was just cold and brutally simple. A couple of Capone's guys dressed up like police officers and walked right into Moran's headquarters. They told Moran's men to line up against the wall, acting like it was just a normal police raid. The men complied. And then Capone's crew just opened fire with machine guns. In the end, 7 men were executed. And here's what really horrified people. They weren't all gangsters. One was a mechanic, John May, who was just there to work on a truck. Another was an optometrist who just, for some reason, liked hanging out with mobsters. The sheer brutality of it, killing civilians, it shocked the entire nation. But here is where it gets wild. While the country is reeling from this massacre, what does Capone do? He goes on a charm offensive. It's the Great Depression, people are starving, and he starts positioning himself as this generous philanthropist, a modern-day Robin Hood who looked out for the little guy. And you know what? It worked. It really worked. He opened these huge soup kitchens that were serving hundreds of thousands of free meals. On Thanksgiving alone, he fed 5,000 people. To a lot of desperate folks in Chicago, Al Capone wasn't a monster. He was their savior. But that massacre, it put him squarely in the federal government's crosshairs. He was now public enemy number 1. President Herbert Hoover himself gave the order, "Gets Capone."
And the weapon they ultimately used to do it was something no one saw coming.
Okay, so you have to understand there were really two different hunts for Capone happening at the same time. You had the famous one with Elliot Ness and his Untouchables doing all these high-profile raids on breweries. It made for great headlines. But the real hunt, the one that actually worked, was happening quietly in the background, led by a Treasury agent named Frank Wilson and his team of accountants. And Wilson's strategy, oh, it was genius. He knew Capone was too smart to have a bank account or to sign checks. So trying to follow a money trail was impossible. Instead, Wilson decided to prove Capone had an income in the first place. He dug up these old accounting ledgers from one of Capone's gambling dens, and in them, he found records of profits being split between a guy named Ralph and someone just initialed as A. The whole case came down to proving that A was Al Capone. If he could do that, he could prove Capone had a massive income that he never, ever paid taxes on. So Capone sees the writing on the wall and tries to do what he always does, make a deal. He offers to plead guilty in exchange for a short, easy sentence. But the judge, a man named James H. Wilkerson, wasn't having it. He refused the deal, and he famously declared, "The court is not a rubber stamp." Capone was going to have to face a full trial. Backed into a corner, Capone goes to his old playbook. If you can't beat 'em, buy 'em. His crew got to work, bribing and threatening every single person on the list for the jury pool. To him, it must have seemed like a foolproof plan. But the judge? Oh, the judge had an ace up his sleeve. The morning the trial was supposed to start, right as everyone is getting settled, he makes a stunning announcement. He orders the bailiff to swap Capone's entire hand-picked, bribed jury with the jury from a completely different trial happening down the hall. It was an absolute checkmate. Capone was floored. And that new, unbribed jury, they found him guilty. And just like that, it was over. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. At the time, the longest sentence ever handed out for tax evasion. His reign of terror had ended. But his story, his myth, that was really just getting started. You know, for a guy who lived so large, his end was anything but glorious. He ended up in Alcatraz, and the syphilis he'd caught as a young man just completely destroyed his brain. He went from being the most feared man in America to this confused, childlike figure. By the time he was released, he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. So when you look back, his legacy is really two-sided, isn't it? On one hand, his crimes were so massive, so out in the open, that they forced the federal government to get smarter, to modernize. The whole idea of using tax evasion to go after mob bosses, that became the main playbook for decades. And on the other hand, culturally, his image, the suit, the fedora, the cigar, it became the gangster archetype we still see in movies and TV shows today. So what do we make of Al Capone in the end? Was he just a brutal, violent criminal? Or was he something more? Maybe a kind of dark reflection of the American dream, a story about the son of immigrants who used incredible ambition, intelligence, and yes, brutal violence to grab for immense power and wealth in a country that gave him very few legitimate ways to get there. That's really the question his story leaves us wrestling with.